The radio crackled with static and desperation. Colonel Marcus Reeves pressed his back against the shattered wall of what used to be a schoolhouse, dust from the latest mortar strike still hanging in the air like a shroud. His Marines were pinned, ammunition running critical, and the enemy was closing in from three sides. He keyed his radio again, voice steady despite the chaos. "Any station, this is Raptor 6. We need immediate air support. Grid November 74289. Danger close." Multiple hostiles in the open. The response came from a voice he didn't recognize, filtered through layers of distance and interference. "Raptor 6, be advised all available air assets have been redirected to priority targets. You're on your own." The colonel looked at his watch. 17 minutes until the next scheduled reinforcement wave, if they could hold that long. His XO, Lieutenant Vasquez, caught his eye from across the rubble-strewn courtyard, the unspoken question hanging between them heavier than the smoke. Then they heard it, a sound that didn't belong in a sky that had been declared empty. It was a low growl at first, distinctive and impossible. The turbofan engines of a Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, unmistakable to anyone who had ever called for close air support. Reeves scrambled to the broken window, scanning the haze-choked horizon. There, emerging from the north like something summoned from a fevered dream, was the angular silhouette of the Warthog, flying low and aggressive, its gray-green camouflage paint weathered by 1,000 missions. The aircraft banked hard, revealing the 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger cannon protruding from its nose like the fang of some ancient predator. "Raptor 6, this is Halo 2-1. I'm 3 minutes out. Mark your position with smoke and get your heads down." The voice was calm, almost conversational, with a slight rasp that suggested too many hours in a pressurized cockpit and not enough sleep. It was a woman's voice, which meant nothing and everything in the split second Reeves had to process it. He didn't care who was flying. He cared that someone was flying. Vasquez popped purple smoke without being told, the canister hissing as it spun into the street, marking their desperate corner of the world with a plume of vivid color against the beige monotony of destruction. The A-10 came in low, maybe 200 feet, and Reeves could see the external fuel tank slung beneath its straight wings, the AIM-9 sidewinders on the outer pylons, and the cluster of Hydra rockets on the inboard stations. But it was the sound that hit first, the unforgettable BRRRRRT of the Avenger cannon, a mechanical roar that split the air and seemed to shake the very atoms of the atmosphere. Spent casings rained down like lethal hail, as 30-millimeter rounds chewed through enemy positions with surgical brutality. Captain Alara Halo Kovac pulled up hard after her first gun run, the stick fighting her as she banked into a tight left turn, the horizon spinning in her canopy. Her hands moved with practiced economy across the throttle and flight controls, and she could feel the airframe shuddering as she pushed it through maneuvers that would have made a safety officer weep. The A-10 wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless, and so was she. She toggled her targeting pod, scanning for the next concentration of heat signatures, her eyes moving in rapid sequence between the multifunction displays and the heads-up display projected on her canopy. The ground below was a maze of broken buildings and narrow streets, and somewhere in that chaos were friendlies who were counting on her to thread the needle. "Raptor 6, I have multiple dismounts moving toward your western perimeter. Engaging now." She didn't wait for confirmation. She rolled inverted for a moment to verify her angle, then pulled the aircraft around into a dive that would have terrified anyone who didn't understand the Warthog's titanium bathtub cockpit and redundant flight systems. The Hydra rockets rippled off in pairs, contrails streaking toward their targets with lethal precision. The explosions below bloomed in sequence, orange and black, and she could see figures scattering, their coordinated assault disintegrating into panicked retreat. Reeves watched from the ground, a grim satisfaction settling over him as the enemy lines crumbled. "Good effects, Halo 2-1, you just saved our collective asses." There was a pause on the radio, just a heartbeat before she responded. "That's what I'm here for, Colonel. Halo 2-1 is Winchester on rockets. Transitioning to gun, how's your ammunition? He didn't sugarcoat it. We're counting rounds. Her voice came back steady, almost gentle. Copy that. I'll keep them off you. Halo 2-1 is staying on station. It was a simple statement, but Reeves understood the weight of it. Staying on station meant burning fuel she might need to get home. It meant exposing herself to ground fire with every pass. It meant choosing their survival over her own margin of safety. She made 3 more gun runs over the next 12 minutes, each one lower and tighter than the last, the Avenger cannon spitting death with mechanical indifference. The enemy scattered, their advance broken, their momentum shattered by a single aircraft that refused to leave. By the time the reinforcement wave arrived, 2 Marine Ospreys escorted by a pair of Cobras, the fight was already over. Halo had bought them time, and in combat time was the only currency that mattered. As the A-10 climbed away, Reeves keyed his radio one last time. Halo 2-1, you have our thanks. Call sign noted for commendation. There was a crackle of static, then her voice, tired but alive. Just doing the job, Raptor 6. Get your people home safe. The debrief happened 3 days later in a tent that smelled of canvas, diesel, and stale coffee. Reeves sat across from his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harding, recounting the engagement with the precision of a man who had seen too much to embellish. When he mentioned Halo 2-1, Harding's eyebrows rose. That was Kovac, he said, leaning back in his chair. Ilara Kovac. Most of the squadron calls her Halo because she's got a habit of showing up when things are at their worst. Reeves nodded slowly, processing the name. She stayed on station until we were clear, burned through her combat load and then some. Harding's expression shifted, something between respect and resignation. That sounds like her. She's got more time in the A-10 than most pilots have in any airframe. Been flying Warthogs since the tail end of the last major conflict. Some people call her reckless. Others call her the best close air support pilot in theater. Later, in the privacy of his makeshift quarters, Reeves found himself digging through personnel files he probably shouldn't have had access to. Captain Ilara Kovac, call sign Halo, 37 years old, 14 years of service, multiple deployments. Her record was immaculate, too immaculate almost. Commendations, successful missions, glowing fitness reports. But there was a gap, a 2-year period where her flight status had been suspended and no explanation was provided in the file. Just a notation, administrative review, pilot reinstated. It was the kind of gap that suggested a story no one wanted to tell. He closed the file and stared at the fabric ceiling of his tent, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. Whoever she was, whatever had happened in those missing 2 years, she had saved his Marines. That was enough. The squadron ready room was a study in controlled chaos. Flight suits hung on pegs, helmets lined the shelves, and the smell of jet fuel permeated everything. Ilara sat in a corner, her flight suit unzipped to the waist, the sleeves tied around her hips, a faded olive t-shirt beneath. She was filling out her post-flight report with the kind of methodical focus that came from having done it 1,000 times before. Her hands were steady, her expression unreadable. Across the room, 2 younger pilots, Lieutenant Cale Jinx Morrison and Lieutenant Riley Dash Ortega, were arguing about the finer points of rocket deployment angles, their voices loud and confident in the way of people who hadn't yet learned that confidence was a luxury. "Hey, Halo," Jinx called over, grinning. "Heard you went full cowboy on a danger close mission yesterday. That true?" Ilara didn't look up from her paperwork. "Danger close is a grid reference, not a state of mind, Jinx. And yes, I provided close air support for a Marine unit under fire." Dash laughed, shaking his head. "You're gonna get yourself killed flying that low. The A-10 might be tough, but it's not invincible." Now she looked up, her gray-green eyes meeting his with a calm that bordered on eerie. "Neither am I, but the Marines on the ground weren't invincible either, and they didn't have the option to climb to altitude." The room went quiet for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the younger pilots like a cold front. Major Garrett Saber Lynn, the squadron operations officer, walked in carrying a clipboard and a cup of coffee that looked like it had been brewed sometime last week. He glanced at Alara, then at the report in her hand. "Kavach, a word," she stood, following him into the small office that served as his command post. He closed the door and leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "You burned through your entire combat load and stayed on station for 15 minutes past bingo fuel," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "That's not standard procedure." Alara met his gaze without flinching. "The Marines were still in contact. I had enough fuel to make it back." Saber sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Barely. You landed with fumes, Halo. That's not risk management, that's a death wish." She didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "With respect, sir, I didn't join the Air Force to play it safe." The rest of the squadron learned about the mission through the usual channels: radio chatter, debrief notes, and the kind of scuttlebutt that spreads through a unit like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some pilots admired her commitment, the willingness to push the envelope when lives were on the line. Others saw her as a liability, someone whose disregard for protocol would eventually get herself or someone else killed. Captain Neil Brick Dawson, a senior pilot with more hours in the A-10 than anyone else in the squadron, fell somewhere in the middle. He found Alara in the maintenance hangar 2 days after the mission, watching as crew chiefs swarmed over her aircraft, patching bullet holes in the tail section, and replacing a hydraulic line that had been nicked by shrapnel. "You pick up some new ventilation," Brick said, nodding toward the damage. Alara glanced at him, then back at the aircraft. "Nothing the maintainers can't fix." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know what they're saying, right? That you're trying to prove something, that you're still trying to earn back your wings after whatever happened 2 years ago." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look at him. "What they say doesn't matter. What matters is that the Marines went home alive." Brick was quiet for a moment, studying her profile. "Fair enough. But just so you know, not everyone thinks you're crazy. Some of us remember what it's like to fly for something more than a paycheck and a pension." That night, alone in her quarters, Alara sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at the photograph she kept tucked in the frame of her mirror. It was an old picture, the colors slightly faded, showing a younger version of herself standing beside an A-10 on a sun-bleached tarmac. Beside her in the photo was another pilot, a man with a wide grin and kind eyes. Her wingman, her best friend, the person who had died because she had made a call that turned out to be wrong. The administrative review had cleared her of any wrongdoing. Mechanical failure, they said, nothing she could have predicted or prevented. But the truth was more complicated, and it lived in the space between exoneration and forgiveness. She had been flying lead. She had chosen the route, and he had followed her into the valley where the surface-to-air missile had been waiting. 2 years grounded. 2 years of questioning every decision, reliving every radio call, wondering if she deserved to fly again. When they had finally reinstated her, she had made herself a promise. She would never leave anyone behind, not ever, even if it meant bending the rules, even if it meant risking everything. The photograph stared back at her, silent and unchanging, and she whispered into the darkness, "I'm still here, Marcus. I'm still flying." Missions continued. The war didn't pause for grief or second-guessing, and the operation's tempo was relentless. Alara flew sortie after sortie, her name becoming a fixture on the flight schedule, her call sign synonymous with reliability. She took the missions others hesitated over, the low-altitude reconnaissance runs, the close air support requests in urban environments, the late-night scrambles when intelligence reports were sketchy and the risk was high. She didn't complain. She didn't grandstand. She just flew, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone in the ready room began to shift. It started with Dash. He was the first to admit, grudgingly, that maybe Halo knew what she was doing. "She pulled me out of a jam last week," he told Jinx over beers one night. "I got turned around during a night mission, lost situational awareness for about 10 seconds. She called out my position and the threat vector before I even realized I was drifting into a hot zone." Jinx raised an eyebrow. "You're saying she saved your ass?" Dash shrugged, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah. I'm saying that." Word spread. Other pilots started paying attention, noticing the little things, how she always monitored the common radio frequencies even when she wasn't on mission, how she stayed late to help maintainers troubleshoot issues with her aircraft, how she never turned down a tasking no matter how dangerous or thankless. Brick was the one who finally said it out loud during a debrief. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Andrea Thunder Voss, had just finished reviewing the week's missions, and the room was winding down when Brick stood up. "I just want to say something," he began, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "I've been flying the Hog for 12 years, and I've flown with a lot of good pilots, but Halo's different. She's not just good, she's committed. She flies like every mission is personal, and maybe that should scare us, but honestly, it makes me feel safer knowing she's out there." The room was silent, and all eyes turned to Alara, who sat in the back row, her expression unreadable. She didn't acknowledge the compliment. She just nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible dip of her chin, and the moment passed. But something had changed. The mockery faded. The skepticism gave way to something harder to define: respect, maybe, or trust, or simply the recognition that Alara Kavach had earned her place among them not through bravado but through sheer, unrelenting competence. The next time Colonel Reeves called for air support, it was Halo's voice that answered. And the time after that. And the time after that. She became the pilot you wanted on your frequency when things went sideways. The one whose presence in the sky was as reassuring as armor plating or a guardian angel. Hence the call sign that had started as a joke, but had become something more. The mission that would cement her legacy came without warning, as the worst ones always do. It was a routine patrol, or as routine as anything could be in a combat zone. Alara was flying with a wingman, a capable but inexperienced pilot named Lieutenant Amara, Rookie Chen. They were tasked with overwatch for a convoy moving through a narrow mountain pass, a stretch of road that intelligence had flagged as potentially hostile but not immediately dangerous. The sky was clear, the kind of bright, sharp blue that made you forget for a moment that people were trying to kill you. Ilara scanned the terrain below through her targeting pod, her eyes tracing the serpentine line of the convoy as it wound through the valley. Everything looked normal, too normal. "Rookie, tighten up your interval," she said over the radio, her voice calm. "You're drifting wide." Amara's aircraft adjusted, closing the gap between them. "Copy, Halo, I'm with you." They had been on station for 20 minutes when the first explosion rippled through the convoy. An improvised explosive device buried in the roadbed detonated beneath the lead vehicle, and the blast sent a column of smoke and debris spiraling into the air. The radio erupted with panicked voices. "Contact, IED. We're taking fire from the ridgeline." Alara's training took over, her mind shifting into the cold, analytical mode that had kept her alive through 1,000 engagements. "Rookie, I'm going low to suppress the ridgeline. You stay high and maintain overwatch. Call out any secondary threats." She didn't wait for confirmation. The A-10 nosed over into a dive, the altimeter unwinding as she plummeted toward the valley floor. The enemy fire was immediate and intense. Tracer rounds arced up from concealed positions along the ridge, stitching glowing lines through the air. Alara felt the aircraft shudder as rounds impacted the armored fuselage, but the Warthog absorbed the punishment like it was built to, because it was. She lined up her shot, the targeting reticle settling over a cluster of muzzle flashes, and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared, the nose of the aircraft vibrating as 30mm rounds poured downrange. The ridgeline erupted in dust and shrapnel, and the enemy fire slackened, but it didn't stop. "Halo, you've got multiple dismounts moving to flank the convoy from the south." Amara's voice was tight with adrenaline. "I see them, rolling in." Alara yanked the stick, pulling the A-10 into a hard left turn that made her vision gray at the edges. She came around in a wide arc, lining up for another gun run, but as she did, her threat warning system lit up like a Christmas tree. A surface-to-air missile, shoulder-fired, had just been launched. The monotone beep of the warning system was almost hypnotic in its urgency. She punched out flares, bright magnesium stars tumbling from the aircraft's dispensers, and broke hard right, the airframe groaning under the G-forces. The missile streaked past, close enough that she could see it through the canopy, and detonated harmlessly behind her. But the threat wasn't over. The enemy had more missiles, and they were learning. "Rookie, I need you to engage the southern group. I'm taking fire from multiple positions." There was a pause, just a fraction of a second, and Alara's instinct screamed. "Rookie, acknowledge." Amara's voice came back shaky. "Halo, I can't get a lock. There's too much terrain masking. I'm afraid I'll hit the convoy." Alara's jaw clenched. She didn't have time to coach, didn't have time to reassure. The convoy was still under fire, and every second wasted was a second closer to disaster. "Break off and maintain altitude. I'm going back in." She rolled the A-10 into another dive, this time even lower, skimming the valley floor at 100 feet, the terrain blurring beneath her. The enemy positions were dug in, hardened, and she would have to get dangerously close to be effective. The Avenger cannon roared again, and she walked the rounds across the hillside, methodically erasing the threat one burst at a time. But the fuel gauge was screaming at her now. She had burned through her reserves, and the warning light glowed red on her dashboard. Bingo fuel, past bingo fuel. She should have been climbing, should have been heading back to base, but the convoy was still pinned. She keyed the radio, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Raptor Actual, this is Halo 2-1. I am Winchester and critically low on fuel, requesting immediate relief." The response was static, then a voice she didn't recognize. "Halo 2-1, nearest available asset is 15 minutes out. Can you maintain 15 minutes?" She did the math in her head. She had maybe 10 minutes of fuel left, and that was if she climbed immediately and flew a direct route home. If she stayed, if she kept fighting, she would run dry before relief arrived. The choice was stark and simple and impossible. She thought of Marcus, her wingman who had died following her orders. She thought of Colonel Reeves and his Marines, of the convoy below that was counting on her, of every promise she had ever made to herself about never leaving anyone behind. The decision crystallized in her mind with absolute clarity. Negative, Raptor Actual, I'm staying on station. There was a long pause, then the voice came back, heavy with understanding and regret. "Copy, Halo 2-1, Godspeed." She made 2 more gun runs, the engine straining, the fuel gauge dropping toward zero. The enemy fire finally stopped, the surviving hostiles melting back into the hills, their attack broken. The convoy began to move again, slowly, painfully, but moving. Alara climbed, the A-10 clawing for altitude, and she turned toward home. The engines coughed once, twice, and then fell silent. Fuel starvation. The cockpit went eerily quiet, the only sound the whistle of wind over the canopy. She didn't panic. There was no time for panic. She had trained for this, had run through the emergency procedures 100 times in simulators and briefs. The A-10 became a glider, heavy and ungainly, but still controllable. She scanned the terrain below, looking for anything flat enough to serve as a landing zone. There, a dried riverbed, narrow but straight, maybe a mile ahead. She adjusted her glide path, trading altitude for distance, her hands moving with practiced precision. "Rookie, Halo 2-1 is going down. I'm attempting a forced landing at grid November 83572. Notify search and rescue." Amara's voice came back frantic. "Halo, I'm with you. I'll cover your position." Alara allowed herself a small smile. "Negative, Rookie. You stay high and guide the rescue birds in. That's an order." The ground rushed up to meet her, the riverbed expanding in her windscreen. She lowered the landing gear, praying the hydraulics still had enough pressure, and they locked into place with a reassuring thunk. She flared at the last possible second, the nose coming up, and the A-10 slammed into the riverbed with a bone-jarring impact. The landing gear collapsed, the fuselage grinding across rocks and sand, and the world became a blur of noise and violence. Then silence. She was alive. Bruised, shaken, but alive. She popped the canopy and climbed out, her legs unsteady, and looked back at the Warthog. The aircraft was a wreck, one wing torn away, the tail section crumpled. But it had gotten her down. It had saved her life one last time. The rescue helicopter arrived 30 minutes later, a Pave Hawk with door gunners scanning the surrounding hills. They pulled her aboard, and as the helicopter climbed, she looked down at the broken A-10 lying in the riverbed like a fallen warrior. It was just a machine, she told herself. Just metal and wiring and fuel. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like goodbye. Back at base, the debriefs were exhaustive and uncomfortable. Saber was there, and Thunder, and a full colonel from Wing Headquarters whose name she didn't catch. They asked her to walk through every decision, every radio call, every moment from the time the convoy was hit to the moment her engines quit. She answered truthfully, without embellishment or excuse. When they asked her why she had stayed on station past bingo fuel, she met their eyes and said simply, "Because they needed me." The colonel from Wing Headquarters leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Captain Kovac, you do understand that you violated standing orders regarding fuel management. You put yourself at unnecessary risk." Alara nodded. "Yes, sir, I understand." He was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "You also saved the lives of 37 soldiers and ensured the success of a critical supply convoy. Your actions were," he paused, searching for the word, "exemplary, reckless but exemplary." Thunder spoke up, her voice firm. "Sir, if I may, Captain Kovac has consistently demonstrated the highest levels of skill and dedication. This squadron would not be the same without her." The colonel nodded slowly. "Noted. Captain, you're dismissed. We'll be in touch." As she left the room, she caught Thunder's eye, and the squadron commander gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. The story spread, as stories do in the military. It moved through the squadrons, the wings, the entire theater of operations. The pilot who had burned through her fuel to save a convoy. The Warthog driver who had glided a crippled aircraft into a forced landing and walked away. Halo. The name took on a weight, a resonance that transcended the individual. It became shorthand for something larger: dedication, sacrifice, the refusal to quit even when quitting was the smart thing to do. Colonel Reeves heard the story and requested a meeting. They sat across from each other in a makeshift cafe on the base, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through old socks. He didn't waste time with small talk. "I wanted to thank you in person," he said. "You saved my Marines twice, once when you showed up and again when you stayed." Alara shook her head. "I was just doing my job, Colonel." Smiled, a tired, knowing expression. "That's what everyone says. But not everyone means it the way you do." They talked for an hour, and in that conversation, Alara learned that Reeves had lost his younger brother in a helicopter crash years earlier, a mechanical failure that could have been prevented if someone had done their job a little more carefully. He understood, in a way few people did, why she flew the way she did, why she couldn't leave, why the weight of other people's lives felt heavier than her own. When they parted, he shook her hand and said, "If I ever need air support again, I hope it's you on the other end of the radio." She nodded, unable to find words that felt adequate, and watched him walk away. The weeks turned into months and the war ground on. Alara flew mission after mission, her record growing, her reputation solidifying. Younger pilots sought her out for advice, for mentorship, for the kind of hard-earned wisdom that couldn't be taught in a classroom. She was patient with them, more patient than she had ever been with herself, and she tried to pass on the lessons she had learned, not just about flying, but about the responsibility that came with it. Jinx, who had once mocked her, became one of her most ardent defenders. "She's the real deal," he told anyone who would listen. "If you can't see that, you're not paying attention." Dash, who had questioned her methods, started flying his missions the way she did: low, aggressive, committed. One evening, as the sun set over the desert in a blaze of orange and red, Brick found her sitting on the wing of a parked A-10, staring at the horizon. He climbed up beside her, settling into a comfortable silence. Finally, he spoke. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were trying to get yourself killed." Alara glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "And now," he shrugged, "now I think you're trying to live, really live, in a way most people never do." She didn't respond, but something in her expression softened, and they sat together as the light faded and the stars began to emerge, pinpricks of cold fire in the vast, indifferent sky. Thunder called her into the office one morning, and Alara walked in expecting another debrief, another round of questions about fuel management or risk assessment. Instead, the squadron commander gestured to a chair and slid a folder across the desk. "Open it," she said. Inside was a letter, official Air Force stationery, bearing the seal of the Secretary of the Air Force. Alara scanned the text, her eyes widening slightly. It was a nomination for the Distinguished Flying Cross, submitted by Colonel Reeves and endorsed by Thunder, Saber, and a dozen other officers she had worked with over the past year. I didn't ask for this, she said quietly. Thunder leaned back in her chair. No one ever does, but you earned it, Halo. Every word of that citation is true. You've flown more danger-close missions than anyone in this wing, and you've never lost a friendly unit under your coverage. Alara closed the folder, her hands trembling slightly. I don't need a medal, ma'am. I just need to keep flying. Thunder's expression was unreadable, but her voice was kind. You'll do both. The medal is about recognition, Halo. It's about making sure people remember what you did and why it mattered. You can't carry all of this alone. The words hit harder than Alara expected, and she found herself blinking back tears she hadn't realized were there. I lost my wingman 2 years ago, she said, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. It wasn't my fault, they said, mechanical failure, but I was lead. I chose the route and he died. Thunder didn't flinch, and you've been trying to make up for it ever since. Alara nodded, unable to speak. Thunder stood, walking around the desk to place a hand on her shoulder. You can't bring him back, Halo, but you've saved dozens of lives since then. Hundreds, maybe. At some point, you have to let yourself believe that's enough. The ceremony was small, held in a hangar with the squadron gathered around. The wing commander, a no-nonsense brigadier general named Holland, pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to Alara's uniform while Thunder read the citation aloud. The words were formal, clinical, but they carried weight, detailing her actions over the convoy, her forced landing, her refusal to abandon the mission. When it was over, the squadron erupted in applause, and for the first time in 2 years, Alara allowed herself to feel something other than guilt. She felt pride, not for the medal but for the people around her, the pilots who had come to trust her, the Marines and soldiers she had protected, the legacy she was building one mission at a time. At night, alone in her quarters, she took out the photograph of Marcus again. She stared at his face, at the grin that would never age, and she whispered, I think I'm okay now. I think I can keep going. She didn't expect an answer, and none came. But the weight in her chest, the crushing pressure that had followed her for so long, felt just a little bit lighter. She placed the photograph back in its spot on the mirror and lay down on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, there would be another mission. Another call for air support, another chance to make a difference, and she would be ready. She was always ready, because that's what Halo did. The months turned into a year, and the war began to wind down. Not with a dramatic finale, but with the slow, grinding reduction of hostilities that characterized modern conflicts. The operation's tempo decreased, the missions became less frequent, and the pilots found themselves with more downtime than they knew what to do with. Alara used the time to mentor, to teach, to pass on everything she had learned to the next generation of Warthog drivers. She became an instructor officially, running training sorties and debriefs with the same intensity she brought to combat missions. The younger pilots revered her, and she took that responsibility seriously, knowing that one day her words might be the difference between life and death for someone else. Brick retired, his 12 years in the A-10 coming to an end with a ceremony that was equal parts celebration and mourning. He found Alara afterward, drink in hand, and pulled her aside. I'm glad I got to fly with you, Halo, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You reminded me why I started doing this in the first place. She smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that few people ever saw. You were a good wingman, Brick. The best. He nodded, swallowing hard. Take care of them, okay? The squadron, they need someone like you. She promised she would, and she meant it. The final mission came without fanfare. It was a routine patrol, the kind she had flown 1,000 times, and as she lifted off the runway and climbed into the sky, she felt a sense of completeness she hadn't expected. The A-10 responded to her touch like an extension of her own body, and she flew with the kind of effortless precision that only came from years of practice. The sky was clear, the air calm, and for a few precious moments there was no war, no loss, no guilt. There was only the flight. She keyed the radio, her voice steady and sure. "Tower, Halo 2-1 is airborne and proceeding to station." The response came back immediate. "Copy, Halo 2-1, good hunting." She smiled. Always good hunting. That was the hope, the promise, the reason she kept flying. Because somewhere someone might need her. And if they did, she would be there. She always would be.